then, folks. How are we doing? Okay, grand. So I'm hoping that everybody is able to kind of navigate and get over to the YouTube page. Yeah, okay, good. So if you stay logged in on Blackboard, this is how you're going to be able to kind of ask me questions. I've got a screen just off to my right hand side where I can have a look and circle back round to see any questions that you guys might have throughout the session. There's a little bit of inherent latency with YouTube, even on the ultra low latency mode. There's still maybe 15-20 seconds or so it is going to take a little bit of time to circle back round and sort of answer your questions. So that would be great. It seems a little bit loud. It might be quite loud actually by comparison to my voice. Let me just change that in OBS for you guys. Bear with me a sec. Okay, I'll just take that down another couple of dBs for you. And then hopefully there'll be a good balance between what we're kind of listening to here and my voice, hopefully. Right, so I've uploaded a track onto Blackboard for you guys, a kind of the pre-master and post-master version of this track, and then we're going to have a little look through the kind of processing chain, have a little look through the types of things that have gone on to get you from this red version here to this orange version underneath, all the sort of processing, all the tricks, etc. Some of the considerations, but I'm just going to play through the track to start with. So you guys have a little idea of what we're going to be working on. Okay, so you should have a sort of rough idea of what the track's about from that section. And I'm going to just hop over to the post mastering version, and we're going to kind of just skip and play through a few bars to see where we start from to where we kind of end up. So this has been sort of fully mixed but not mastered. It has been normalized so that the loudest peak reads at like 0 dB or 0.1 minus 0.10 dB, something like that. Whereas this one, we can kind of see it's obviously been through quite heavy, substantial kind of compression, limiting that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to play this and then start flicking between the two versions for us. So actually, I might start back with the post one again. Actually, sorry, pre-master. Oops. So we should be able to hear quite a substantial difference between those two as that goes through there. Everything's kind of much more heavily compressed in the post mastering version, and yeah, the tone has obviously changed quite dramatically as well. Bear with me a sec. I'll be back in 1 second. Sorry about that. Right, so yeah, the post-mastering version has been significantly more compressed. We can kind of see that in the waveform here. We can see that there's a lot less dynamic range in this second version here, this orange one, compared to the waveform overview of that red one just there. But it's really sort of some of the changes in the tonality that are more interesting necessarily than the dynamic ones, and how we get from those two different worlds. So let's have a listen to the sort of breakdown and the drop, the most kind of important section in the pre-master versus the post-master. Listen to that pre-version. So quite big sort of dramatic changes between the two versions, the pre-master and the post-master version. Has anybody got any kind of comments on the differences between those two so far? Is anybody noticing anything particular between those two other than the big kind of change in loudness? Post is more energetic, yeah, definitely. Yeah, the vibrancy of it is kind of hyped up quite a lot through that kind of mastering process. Essentially, there's a few things to do with that we'll have a little look at. Now I'm going to take you through this project in Logic. I really shouldn't have done that. Let's pull that back down. Yeah. Metering up here. For some reason I've lost it off the top of the bloody screen. Come on. Oh, bloody thing. No, I've absolutely lost that off it there. Oh, that's irritating. Right, let's just go back. Get rid of that. Put a new one on. Go to metering in Logic. Meter true peak in RMS. Let's try that again. Across here. So I've got a couple of different metering systems that I use personally. And the things that I'm looking out for with the different versions of the tracks, these different things, are the peak level and the RMS level in terms of the level meter here, and on the Brainworks one I'm looking at the LUFS range, which is the new kind of kid on the block, that people are kind of worried about LUFS standards and certain things hitting certain rates to do with LUFS. And I'm using the FFT analysis here just to see roughly what the kind of tonal shape of my track is versus other tracks in my kind of reference list. So I've got all of these on the master fader, but everything else, all the kind of processing on the pre-master and the post-master are done on the individual channel level, just so that we can kind of see what's happening on a track level, and that none of those processes are going to get added on to any of my reference material. So they're just used as a visual aid for that output there. So what I have here is essentially a list of reference tracks that were quite popular on the year of the release of the track when I wrote and when I did the remix of this one. So this was a kind of contemporary 2019 tracks, what were kind of quite big, what tracks were doing quite well in this sort of subgenre of dance music. A kind of classic reference track list. They're not really classic tracks necessarily, but they're 3 tracks that I really admire the mixing and mastering on, especially the mastering on a couple of them. This one is ridiculously loud and sounds really big, which is what we kind of want, a big, exciting sort of sound for the club track. I've then got another sort of third section of reference tracks here, and what this is for is to make sure that I'm kind of mastering to a standard that is comparable with previous releases on the record label. So I'm checking the previous back catalogues of the last couple of releases just to make sure I'm roughly in the ballpark with the mastering that I'm currently doing to stuff that's already been released that's already part of the canon of the record label, if that makes sense. And then I've got my pre-master version with the headroom on there, so that'll be, this one hasn't been normalized, so there will still be a bit of headroom here. That's quite close on there. And then I've got my postmaster version here as well. So here it is, but then through all of these processes. Although looking at that waveform, that file may have actually been normalized from that last session, so I might have to go back in and actually take away some of the headroom on that track. I may have made a mistake there. Bear with me a sec. Waveform modified today. Okay. Might have to use the Spotify version that won't have been tampered with in that same sense. So in a club track like this, what do you think are the most important sections to think about when it comes to mastering? What are kind of important considerations that we need to make sure are kind of thought about and taken care of? Bills and falls, yeah, definitely. Yeah, the builds, the breakdowns, the drops, those sorts of things. All the kind of sort of key marker points for DJs, really, for DJ mixing. So the intro, first kind of minute of the track, that needs to sort of sound quite good, but not as exciting as this next sort of minute of the track. Then you've got about another minute of the breakdown that's got to be hyped back up to this section here, which is going to be the drop, the most important bit. And then we've kind of essentially got a mirror image of the track going backwards, where this section is essentially that section. This section is essentially that intro. So it's kind of mirrored from this point. So I've got to make sure that the intro sounds quite good and that the things are kind of working. But the biggest point and the biggest biggest sort of point of reference is actually this drop. So what I've done in this project, is I've actually cut the other tracks and these other records into bits where I've now got them at the drop, and I've got my loop locator around here, so that all the really most critical section of the mastering is actually focused in on here, and then I make sure that everything either side of this section still falls into place and isn't kind of too over compressed or not kind of compressed enough, that sort of stuff. So what I've done as well, if we have a look over here, is I've actually measured the RMS from Logic's analysis, from the Brainworks metering and analysis, and I've also had a look at what the LUFS rating is with the Waves plugin. So I've used all three different ones because sometimes when people are talking about loudness standards and talking about certain sort of numerical values that they're trying to hit, they could be using it from a different metering tool or a different metering system that actually gives a slightly different numerical readout for the same result. So here we've got the Brainworks metering plugin, and that is metering the drop. The intro is coming in at minus 4.3 RMS, whereas Logic's is minus 6.8 RMS. It's saying the drop is 7.1 versus 4.7, etc. And in the LUFS one from Waves, it's kind of saying that the intro is basically one LUFS quieter than the drop, in essence, which is kind of a more comparable thing. If we have a little look at these other tracks, they're kind of doing a similar thing. The intro is going to be slightly quieter than the drop, which is what you'd kind of expect this is a kind of range that we're looking to aim for. So I can see that holistically, my RMS, I want it to be roughly between sort of maybe -5 and -7 on the BX standard, between sort of -6 and -9 maybe on the Logic one. I think Dave told me why this might be some time ago. I think he mentioned that it's to do with whether you use a square wave or a sine wave to calibrate your metering and your measurement system. So this is why they're slightly off from one another, and they're not always consistent. So be careful when you are using metering systems inside your DAWs, inside whatever third-party plugin you are using, as you would think that the levels would be universal irrespective of which software you use, but it's actually not the case. As we can kind of see here, there's quite different numerical readouts for what is exactly the same file and the exact same audio under the hood. So it's worth having a little look at that. And this is why I kind of use a few different tracks and use a few different plugins just to get a kind of rough ballpark consensus, so that I know that I'm kind of where I kind of need to be, where I want to be. And we can see that the kind of classic ones are a little bit louder. This one at -4 LUFS is ridiculously loud, insanely loud, but it doesn't sound over compressed. That's what I quite like about this track. It is crazy loud. There's absolutely no denying it. I would never normally look to work at those kind of levels, but the artist does it in a kind of clever way where it actually sounds pretty good, contrary to what you might think when looking at those sorts of values. Same for the Sean Tyas. This is maybe a tiny bit overcompressed, and the Mike Shiver one maybe a tiny bit overcompressed as well. But they do sound good. They do work in a kind of DJ set. They do work in nightclubs. I've played these tracks out in previous sets before, and it works well on the dance floor. So for this type of music, we are looking at kind of the loud is good thing kind of does carry over a little bit, maybe more so than kind of rock and pop stuff, or if we're talking about having tracks played on the radio or on streaming services where they're going to do some of this kind of loudness normalization and drop things to sort of -14 LUFS or -23 LUFS. That kind of stuff is more prevalent there, but on a dance floor situation, this is more what we're kind of looking at. So I'm actually going to start with the reference tracks. I'm going to just play a couple of these so we can have a little listen and see what the drops sound like on these reference tracks here. So I'd say probably, with the exception of that last track, all of these ones here roughly feel like they fit together. Now they do have different tonalities, they do have different kind of mix qualities. Sometimes the kick is more prevalent than others, the bass line's more prevalent, etc. Some of the big synth stuff is bigger on some tracks versus the others. They do have different characteristics, and they're not, you know, exact like for like kind of copies, but with the exception of this track, they all kind of roughly feel like they fit with one another. As I'm kind of soloing through them and listening through to the different tracks, they all kind of feel like they're roughly related. They could easily kind of be in the same either radio show or DJ set, or on the same kind of compilation album, without too much fuss or too much kind of nipping and tucking, with the exception of then obviously this one that comes in way louder. So then I've got my back catalogue stuff here as well, to just check and see where my stuff previous stuff on the label kind of sits. And again, it's kind of, you know, roughly in the ballpark of these other tracks. So I've got my postmaster version here, my pre-master. I'm actually going to use my postmaster version of the Spotify track, because I think I did accidentally normalize the track, the underlying audio file, and it's made a destructive change. So I can see the difference there. It's not going to work with that version. So I'm going to use the Spotify postmaster version, which just doesn't have the intro or the outro stuff when kind of comparing contrasting here. So here we've got the track. We've probably no headroom on this, so I might actually as well at this particular juncture go in and maybe put in minus 5 dB of gain to give us a bit of headroom to work with the plugins, or what you would typically expect to kind of find. So let's just have a little listen to this drop again. Minus 3's maybe more applicable. So I've got to kind of get from roughly here to a place where it can rub shoulders and stand sort of side by side, this kind of level. So at the main when we kind of flick between the two references, it doesn't really stack up. Certainly doesn't against this one. It feels quite weak by comparison to that. Again, it just kind of feels weak and kind of like it couldn't stand up for itself in a fight against these other tracks. So what I want to have a look at is the chain of effects that we kind of put together to give us this big mastered version at the end. And I'm going to go through them kind of one at a time to start with, and have a little look. So the first and foremost, I'll get the EQ analysis, so that I can kind of check it against these sort of standards. Oops. So I can see that my peak value, I've got a few sort of 3 or 4 dBs worth of headroom, roughly, to 3 to 6, somewhere like that. And I'm going to try and get this RMS level up from about minus 16. I think if I look at these plugins and get rid of those a sec, on Logic I want to get it in the ballpark of between sort of minus 9 and minus 7, I'd say. Minus 6 is probably going to be a little bit too hard, but where I want to be is sort of in this ballpark. I want that RMS level, this one here, to be pushed up to there. And if I do that just by turning the track up by 3 dB, because of the headroom that I get, it's not going to jump up to that level of RMS, that average loudness, on either that version or of course on my Brainworks version. So really kind of important plugin at the start of my chain here. I've talked about this a little bit before. I think I talked about it a little bit last semester. Is this Brainworks saturator. Now I'm not actually doing anything fancy with it. I'm not actually doing any saturation stuff with this plugin here. But what I am taking advantage of is this section down here, this thing called the Mono Maker. And what this is doing is it's actually folding everything down to mono below 100 Hertz. So it's any sort of phasing issues that I might have with any low-end synths, which are often quite programmed to be quite wide sounding, are kind of folded into mono. Anything that I'm doing with my kind of kick drums or my low end, any samples that are layered up together, everything below 100 Hertz is going to be folded down to mono. So it's going to tighten up that low end of the club track, which is really important. So that's what that is doing there. The next thing I'm doing is I'm actually going to get rid of some of the bass, which you might think is a bit counterproductive in something like a club track, but actually all I am doing here is getting rid of everything below 30 Hertz. I'm just tapering it off very slightly to remove it, and I'm using a linear phase EQ for this. And I've chosen a linear phase EQ because it's a kind of mastering stage, so we should be using our kind of best in-class tools that we have available. So I don't want there to be any phase shifts by any EQ boosts or cuts that I'm going to do. Even though they're relatively subtle, I want to use kind of like my gold China, gold standard China when doing these kind of processes. So even though it's a really basic thing like filtering off the bottom end, I'm still making sure that I'm using a kind of good quality linear phase EQ. I'm also using a linear phase multi-band dynamics processor. I don't know whether you guys use sort of multi-band stuff or multi-band compressors. I kind of hate them, if I'm really honest. I think they're really difficult to actually manage, and what you end up doing is probably attacking more bands than you actually need to. So essentially what I'm actually doing with this multi-band compressor is I'm just trying to reduce the low end and control all the sub bass and those kind of low mids a little bit. So we can see here that the levels are slightly above where I've set the threshold, and you can, unlike a kind of regular compressor, what I quite like about this Waves one is it's actually allowing me to compress to a range, so it's giving me a maximum amount of decibels it's actually going to reduce stuff by. So this is set to kind of minus 5.1 across the board there, so it's not going to kind of sort of go too mental. It's going to keep things, even if it could compress this by much heavier levels, it's not actually going to. So this is only giving the really low end and the really high end stuff just a little gentle kind of tickle to kind of keep it under control. So let's switch that on and let's have a little look. It's barely perceptible from the visual. And essentially it's just taking the really low end down by like 1 to 2 dB on that band. It's not doing anything more dramatic than that. I find that with multi-band compressors, that if you and multi-band limiters as well, if you do anything particularly extreme, or if you go more than 1 or 2 dB, you actually end up making stuff sound a lot worse than what it did like without the plugin. So this is a very gentle sort of attenuation of that extreme low end and some of the extreme highs, which I'm actually going to boost again here with this. So this is some tape saturation that I'm adding in using the Waves J J37 tape plugin. It just adds a bit of coloration to the low end. And a little bit of excitement at the kind of upper frequencies as well. So it's a relatively subtle bit here. It's not crazy heavy-handed sort of things, because they tend not to reap many benefits at the mastering stage. You've got to make sure that your track is already in quite a good state and quite a good position before actually adding stuff to it, or before taking it to the kind of mastering stage. If there's loads and loads of problems in the mix, you should be looking to kind of solve them there. You should be really just adding these kind of final bits of polish, these little bits of kind of tone shaping here and there, and sorting out a few little kind of problems with dynamic range. But in general, you should have your mix in a quite a good stage before you get to start sort of bringing out these sorts of plugins. Next thing I've got here is another sort of harmonic exciter, in essence, this Vitamin, and I'm just, again, it's a multi-band processor, and it's just adding some harmonic excitement in these different areas, in these different frequency bands, and I'm just adding a little bit of low and low mid excitement and energy to this bottom end. So we're just hyping up that extreme low end and the low mids, where there's a bit of bite and a bit of click on that kick drum. And then essentially where some of these high frequencies, extreme high frequencies live, they've been boosted ever so slightly, just been overcooked there. And this high mids section I've actually done on there, oops, I have to zoom out because my mouse is being slightly funny, is I've actually widened that frequency band as well. So I've added in some harmonic excitement, but also some stereo widening to that band. It's actually where quite an important section of the kind of synths live. So that's with that section bypassed. So again, it's just adding a little bit of kind of coloration across the frequency spectrum at those particular points, sort of artificially saturating those with sort of fake harmonics, essentially. And then I've got a fab filter compressor on here just to control some of the dynamics, and I'm using the sidechain option here, so that what I'm doing is I'm kind of ignoring the kick drum, and I'm only compressing the stuff that's sort of above the kick drum, really. So you can see where the threshold is kind of being set there. And we're kind of ignoring the stuff below the kick. And again, you can see that it's really not doing that much. It's only taking away between sort of 2 and 3 dB. So it's a very gentle level of compression here. It's not crazy stuff. we're going to save a little bit of that characterful compression actually for this SSL bus compressor. So a software model of what we've got in the SSL studio, the master bus compressor. And again, that's just adding in a little bit of dynamic control by compressing the track by sort of 3 or 4 dB. So that those differences between the intro section and the drop are kind of lessened really, and brought a little bit more under control, but no individual plugin is kind of working particularly hard at this juncture. And then I've used a match EQ against one of my reference tracks. I can't actually, if I'm honest with you, remember which reference track I used to learn the EQ curve of, but I measured my EQ versus their EQ, and they were a little bit brighter, a little bit more energy in the kind of low mids. I'd scooped too much out between 500 and a K, and I'd gone a little bit over with the sub and a little bit under with the with the kind of meat of the kick basically. So there's a couple of dBs difference here, and there's a bit of sheen at the end here. You can kind of fade the extremes so that when you're applying these EQ compensation curves, you're kind of just applying them more gently and more subtly. I've applied it at 50%. You can go less, you can go more. They kind of recommend 100, or the 100 is the kind of default thing, but I actually think a more subtle approach is a little bit better. So I'm sort of sonically trying to move towards a reference track rather than copy it outright. And that's the same with the smoothing. You can kind of change this to do really weird kind of angry, horrible shapes, but I think it makes much more sense to go more gently and just sort of push your track in the broad direction of the tracks that you're trying to sound like or you're trying to be like, rather than go for that kind of direct copy. And because it's at the mastering stage as well, you have the option for the phase to be either minimal or have a linear phase, so it shouldn't create any kind of weird artifacts to the tonality, because obviously that's an important thing at this stage. And yeah, so that's what I've done here. I've tried to bridge that gap between the tonality of the track that at this stage and the reference track that I was using. And again, it's quite subtle. None of these things in isolation should completely change the sound of your kind of pre-master to post-master. All of these small incremental changes here with this plugin chain are broadly very light touches to the material. They're not crazy adjustments where you're kind of listening to the audio before and after and thinking, wow, this is night and day, this sounds completely different. It's just little subtle enhancements, 1 or 2% that you're sort of adding with each sort of process, so that maybe your track is 10 to 15% better at the end than it was coming in. And this is something that that is worth cut out as well when mastering is when mastering something like this, something that's meant to be quite loud and kind of built for a dance floor, something where you're kind of aiming for anything under -9 LUFS, anything where you're kind of aiming for these really loud levels of mastering. If you're trying to do that, then one of the things you're going to lose inherently is the dynamic changes between one section and the next. So what is quite a good thing to do before this final processor, you can do it after it as well. I've seen and I have done it afterwards as well, but I quite like trying to do it going into the limiter this time. I'll show you on this postmaster one here, is actually add in some artificial dynamic changes. So you're pushing the audio into and out of the limiter. So I've added a gain plugin here so that these changes in level have an impact on where you set the threshold on your limiter, so that you can kind of artificially hype up and change between these sections. You can kind of add in a bit of dynamic change and a bit of dynamic contrast to a loud mastered track, essentially. And you could do this afterwards with the fader and have it post mastering, but for this particular version I thought it just worked quite nicely going into the mastering limiter. And from personal experience, what I would say is the biggest difference, or the biggest change that you'll make to your track, will be with your final mastering limiter. You can do all these little changes en route and make these small improvements, getting it as kind of good as you can to this stage, and then you're essentially pushing the level of the audio up towards a ceiling, so that you can kind of push it up to increase that loudness, to sort of artificially inflate that RMS level, and get those lufs a bit louder. So let's have a little listen to this before and after this this plugin. So that's where the biggest change in loudness kind of comes, really. Now I'm pushing that a little bit hotter than I perhaps should. We can see that there are some peaks sort of above where we'd normally like to have them, but they are very fast transient ones based on the kick drum. So I've actually turned the attack up so that it's letting some of the tracks through, so it's not pumping too much, and making the release a little bit quicker than maybe you would have. 600 milliseconds is actually not that quick, I suppose, really, for when we're talking about mastering. A little bit of a look ahead on here, and making sure that your kind of actual peak value is going to what your output ceiling is minus 0.1 dB true peak. So I shouldn't be getting any intersample peaking in theory, although I'm sure on the waves loudness meter it's saying that it is. That it's found some of them. But all of these things added together on aggregate kind of get you from but there's a big change in the tonality as well, I think, other than just the loudness. One of the things that you really notice, or that I personally noticed, is how bassy the pre-master sounds by comparison. But when we actually put the analysis plugins on, touch the postmaster, we can actually kind of see that it's got a really nice the meter levels will be really different, so I'm doing that on the channel fader rather than the master fader. Okay, so we've got our lifts all back there, but I've just turned it down. But we can still see on here that I've managed to get over that -9 RMS. On Logic's meter we can see that it's kind of coming in sort of -6 RMS on the Brainworks meter. Our peak value is kind of there at 0 dB. Those kicks and all those synths and stuff aren't actually clipping. Well, depending on what metering you're looking at, it's saying that it's at 0 dB true peak. Maybe I should have gone 0.3 of a dB for the true peak limiter on the FabFilter one. But it's kind of got to the right kind of loudness levels to rub shoulders with these other tracks. And by comparison, when you look at the EQ curves of this track versus those Pro ones, you will see that actually they surprisingly, even for club stuff, the balance, it's always going to have a low kick end like this, but actually from about 300-400 Hertz, it's quite level and quite flat like white noise up until about 10k, where it starts tapering off. So you don't tend to, for these types of clubs tracks, get these sort of pink noise curves. It's actually much closer to a white noise curve from about 200 Hertz to about 10k, and then it starts tapering off and obviously going up significantly at that low end. So it's worth having a little look at your kind of reference material, seeing where it's kind of at, what are the most important areas of the track sort of tonally, and work towards them before you kind of get to your limiting stage and your kind of heavy-handed dynamics processing stage. Because we can see here that actually we start with a little bit of EQ, we look at the low end here, bit of low end harmonic saturation, bit of dynamics, final kind of tone shaping changes, and then again the last kind of big kind of slam with the limiter. And that's the kind of process that I've put in place here. That's what's actually going on in these tracks, and using the analysis of these other tracks to kind of make sure that yours is roughly in the right place. So I'm just going to drop the level of this so I can talk over it, and I'm going to flick through these different tracks here. We'll have a look at these EQ curves. So again, relatively flat up till 10k, and then it starts tapering off a bit, but low end still quite big at around sort of 50-60 Hertz. Relatively flat frequency response from 200 up to 10k again. This track maybe not quite as bright with the vocals, a little bit louder in the low mids by comparison. Tapering off here, I'd expect to see a little bit more brightness there, but it's probably just leaving some space for the vocals as well. The bass is a little bit stereo from sort of 100 Hertz, which is a bit weird. Not quite as tight at the low end, probably because they haven't done something like use that mono maker. You can see that there's a left and right channel differential in their low end from their kick samples and from their soft synths that goes all the way across this section. If I zoom in here, we can see that there are two lines for the left and right channel, and those should be absolutely 100% in unison. And that's one of the reasons that I'm such a fan of the Brainworks stuff with the mono maker, because it really tightens up the sound of your low end, and by comparison, because we don't have any weird phasing stuff or any weird stereo things at the bottom end below 100 Hertz where we don't really want them. Let's have a listen to this other track. Not many of the Pro tracks actually have that in there. You must not know about the BX Master. But again, this track bit more energy in the low mids by comparison to the high stuff. But we can see again, there's not a massive differential between that 10k and sort of 200. It's pretty close really. There's only sort of maybe 6 dB difference. in those average levels there, so relatively constant. This one's a bit more spiky, bit heavier at the low end, and the low mids of this lead synth line are kind of coming in there, so a bit more prominent, a bit different compared, but it's to do with the instrumentation of that track, so I wouldn't worry too much that mine would be massively different from this one because of the way the track's put together. It's just a cool holistic reference really, rather than a hyper nerdy analytical one. Again, this tidy one is maybe a little bit more akin to the pink noise. It does drop off a bit more where it's kind of putting its money. Line's crazy like that. Managing to, it's just got no dynamic range in whatsoever. Loads of true peaks and intersample peaking in this track. But it kind of works. And then another one from my label. So it feels really quiet by comparison to that other track. But in that kind of ballpark. And then I think we're actually back onto the pre-master, so a bit quieter there. So we can kind of use that analysis and go through that to give you a holistic understanding of where you're at. But also what was quite good with the Sean Tyas track in there is to make sure when you do see differences in these sort of visual analysis, when you're using it as terms of reference tracks, to not freak out and go, oh, I need to go back and change everything because there's more spikes at 300 hertz and 3K versus my track. It's not about kind of freaking out about that. It's just about using broad, holistic sort of analysis to guide you on your way to getting closer so that your tracks sound like the pro tracks. That's essentially what all that you're doing when you're looking at the visual analysis or of the sort of spectrograms and EQ, FFTs, those sorts of things, but also when you're looking at the numerical values, they don't really tell the full story necessarily either, but it just gives you something to aim at, something to aspire to. But I'm going to just play this round again with the sort of mastered version and just talk a little bit about what you're kind of aiming for and why to aim for it. Why am I not going right? Well, I want my track to be as loud as this tidy track. Why am I not aiming for -4 LUFS at the drop? And one of the big reasons that I'm not over-egging this track, I mean, it's obviously, you know, when we had a look at the FabFilter limiter, it's pushed quite high, and I'm already pushing the kick drums over that kind of ceiling, and it's already having to compress stuff by maybe 3 or 4 dB louder than you'd naturally want it to get up to this level. And part of the reason for this is it's a stylistic thing to do with kind of electronic music, is that it is overhyped and overcompressed, and it kind of works, like I say, on the dance floor, in DJ sets, those kind of things. The kind of things that you'd maybe be critical of in other genres actually kind of ports over quite well. But when we started this process, I'm just going to turn that chain off actually. One of the things that we were trying to do is go from sort of -16, -17 RMS up to between -9 and -7, somewhere like that. Now, when trying to get your peak level up from whatever it is, whatever your peak level is, getting it to 0 is the easiest thing in the world. You can literally bounce the file, go and normalize it, and it will analyze the file to find the loudest peak to make sure that it doesn't theoretically doesn't theoretically go over 0 dB. That's not difficult to do at all. In fact, I could just read this and go, oh, what's the maximum peak value as this track plays through? Oh, -3.7. I could add a gain plugin, add 3.7 dB or 3.6, and it would be just under the point of distortion for when bouncing it out. That's not difficult to do, but what is difficult to do is to actually increase that RMS. It gets exponentially more difficult to increase the RMS. So to go from -16 to -15, not too bad. -15 to -14, a little bit harder again as it goes up and up and up. And once you start sort of getting from -12 to -9, each time you get the track louder, without it sounding worse, with it still sounding better and being an improvement, and that's like a massive win. It's so difficult to go up. This is an exponential curve of difficulty in getting stuff to be louder but also sound good and not end up like that bloody Metallica album or some of Skrillex's stuff that's a bit too overmastered, some of those sorts of things where they've just gone too far basically. So that becomes really difficult to do. And in order to kind of get to that, you need to control basically all these little stages in the journey up until your limiter, so that there's not huge jumps, not huge sort of variances in the dynamics. We can see here on that audio file, it's not crazily different all the way through. It's still pretty well controlled for the whole of that drop. But we are going to throw it into a limiter to get it like this bottom visual here, so that it is kind of really hyped up. To bridge that kind of gap is a kind of important thing in that sense. So, does anybody have any kind of questions on this stuff? Why using X plugin over Y plugin? Why use one limiter over another limiter, etc., etc.? I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to type this up here. Does anybody think that they would be able to sort of comfortably get the track mastered from this level to the kind of pro level? Do people feel that they'd be sort of comfortable and able to do that relatively well? Or do we think, oh, it'd be a bit challenging still? Where do you guys kind of feel with that? No one's got much of an opinion on this. Okay, not to worry. One thing that I will have a little look at here is actually where the track's not really actually ready for mastering. So I'm going to close this project down. Oops. I'm going to save that, and I'm going to open this. Which track was it? I think it was Tiber Island. And we're going to have a little look at essentially aborting the mastering stage and realizing that you need to go back to the mix to fix some stuff. So let's go, that's post-master, let's go pre-master, let's have a little listen to the track. Sorry, that's a bit weird because of that. Let's get rid of the Cinemax stuff. So I've had to turn that up. Quite allowed to hear that in my cans. But the track itself is in a relatively healthy position at this stage. If we have a look, we can see there's not too much dynamic variation in the pre-master. But this is one that I've actually had to abort with the mastering process. And if I take us over to the post-master version, similar ideology, similar kind of chain. A little bit of gain staging in there as well, guess for some reason. A couple of compressors trying out some different things, different types of compressors to see what's kind of working and what isn't on there. Bits of EQ stuff, the match EQ thing. Whoops. Match EQ, SSL linear phase EQ, and then the limiter at the very end. Trying to go even more crazy with it. But this actually sounds terrible on the postmaster version, so let's have a little listen to these differentials here. Oh, postmaster, sorry. So I'm having to push this 11 dBs at the limiter stage just to hit minus 9 dB kind of RMS in Logic of probably 6-ish. Minus 6, minus 7 on the Brainwork stuff. And I can't remember what we were on the LUFS. Kind of minus 8, minus 9, that sort of thing. So at this stage, it doesn't sound too bad. I mean, we can see it's probably, again, a little bit higher and going in a little bit hotter than I'd like into the limiter, but not sounding horrific, really, for considering it's going in plus 11 dB. It does have quite a lot of headroom going into the track, but we're having to go in pretty hard to get quite modest return. And this is one of the things I was saying about it being exponentially more difficult to go up in terms of 1 dB RMS at a time. It's actually very, very challenging, very, very tricky indeed. I was kind of lucky with the last track. It was in quite good condition, whilst it would have been quite challenging to master to an extent. It was also relatively straightforward. It was very, very doable, whereas with this track I've had to completely abort it. So one of the things I really want you guys to have a little listen to here is in this post-mastering section. I don't know why the track's cut up there. It's a bit weird in that sense. It's still the same. Automation data to erase. Oh, I see. There's some mistake in. Oh, I remember what that's for. I'll come back to that. Why it's chopped off and looking weird on here. But actually, let's maybe get rid of that. Let's extend. Oops, so wrong bloody key command for zooming in and out. Let's just extend this back out here to the full fat version as it was. So let's have a listen to a few bars before the breakdown. Did anybody notice anything weird with the audio going from the section with the drums into the breakdown? Let's have a listen again. It might be quite hard to tell, but actually this first kick drum here should sound exactly the same as the other kick drums in this section. But you can see it takes a bit of time for the track to come in, but it really clamps down, the limiter clamps down really, really hard on that first transient because of the amount of limiting that's happening, because we're pushing it up into the stratosphere with that sort of 11 dBs of limiting. It's kind of over pumping and over exaggerating this section as it kind of falls away, and this first transient here of this kick drum completely changes the sound of the drums. So let's have a listen. Let's have a listen again. So that's way too loud for a breakdown section. So it's kind of clamping down and changing the tonality of that first kick in there. And basically there's not enough contrast in this section. This is still way too loud. In fact, I might just actually bounce out a really small section. Let's just grab maybe this here and do a bounce in place of that section. Let's call this Tiber Island post mastering. It's going to take a few seconds to render that out. I'd be very interested to see what the waveform looks like post all this processing. But essentially, for this particular track, the cure has been sort of worse than the disease, really. The fact that it's not quite loud enough has meant that I've had to try and push stuff too far with these sorts of processes, to the point where it's just distorting like crazy in certain sections. It's overhyping these bits here. We can kind of see it really clearly. Now that should be a nice tapering off. Let's just have a listen to the pre-master version. Let's listen how nice this kind of fades away by comparison. So it's kind of just, you can still hear that sidechain compression and the stuff pumping, but if we have a listen to this, we can just see it's still super hyped. Again, that first kick drum. The kick drums still sound punchy and still sound quite good in this little break section before it kicks into the to the drop here, and it's still sounding quite nice. But in this sort of hyper compressed one here, it's just all sounding dreadful. And there's nowhere for it to go because it's so overinflated with these levels of compression and these this processing chain being so heavy-handed, all for the purpose of chasing this RMS goal. So let's put So whilst I've kind of got there with the drop and got to the kind of numerical targets that I was going for, it's kind of at the -9 RMS on here in Logic. It would kind of feel and fit well with the other tracks. The LUFS, it's, what was it, -8, -9. It's not a million miles away from what these other sort of pro tracks. Oops, we're talking D. No, I can't remember what the bloody notes thing is. There we go. It's not a million miles away from some of these other tracks. Some of the other things in the sort of ballpark of other releases, -7 to -8, -8 to -9 on the lifts isn't the sort of end of the world. For it, it's not quite as loud as the other tracks, but it's doing real damage to the breakdown. The breakdown's knackered. It just doesn't work by comparison now. There's no kind of dynamic contrast. There's no sort of relaxing stuff before it hypes up again. So this is an example of a track where personally I've had to kind of abort the mastering process, and I'm going to have to revisit it in the mix. It's just simply not good enough, in a good enough, healthy enough position to be mastered. Loudly. So I thought it'd be worth kind of showing you that as well, because it's quite easy to sort of chase the numbers and chase this kind of loudness at all costs, where it's really kind of not worth it after a certain point. You know, you do more harm than good. So yeah, be really wary of that when it comes to you guys doing mastering, basically. Let's go away there for a sec. Let's bring that other project back round. So does anybody else have any other questions? If not, I might leave it there. Does anybody else want me to show any more stuff or delve into anything more in this project to do with either your reference tracks or the processing chain, etc., or why I've gone about sort of typing up these things over here on the right? Or is everybody kind of roughly happy with what we've had a look at today? Okay, I've got nothing there on the Blackboard tab, so I'm probably going to leave it there for you folks. Now I've given you guys the pre-master file. In fact, I might need to that's what I should do. I might have to re-download the pre-master off Blackboard so I can re-import it into the project without it being normalized. But I've given you guys the pre-master version of it and the post-master version. I can't really give you these other tracks because they're I don't have the copyright for those. I do for these other ones here if you'd like those uploaded as well, to kind of work against this this idea of making sure that your tracks sit well within the own back catalogue of the record label or the project or the artist that you're working with. It doesn't have to be the same record label. It could be an artist's previous work from a different record label, but making sure that there's some sort of lineage and consistency, and that your standards and your levels are at least on par with previous work. Ideally, you're going to try and improve it and get better and better each time, but certainly no worse than your previous stuff. Tracks that you really admire, tracks that are kind of contemporary, use them for your analysis. Make sure that you do kind of the equivalent for your genre. So if you were doing rock and pop stuff, you would do verse versus chorus, and you would cut the track up and make sure that you've got your reference tracks all at a kind of verse and all at a chorus section or an intro, etc. So you can make sure that your parts of your track kind of stack up against the pros in that sense. That's why everything's kind of cut up here, going from the intro sections into the drops. And yeah, make sure when you are using these plugins chains and processing chains, just a little bit of improvement per plugin is kind of what you're looking for. 1 or 2% improvement on aggregate is what you should be going for pretty much every time, until you get to the limiter stage, which is where we go in a bit more heavy-handed. In terms of stuff that you guys have got access to in the labs and in the studios at the uni, you have the McDSP stuff, which is really good. You've got the ML4000, the ML8000 series as well. You also have the UAD stuff in the studios that has got some good things. The UAD precision limiter is probably one worth exploring. It's got some of the Brainworks stuff. I don't think it's got that metering plugin. Not sure about the the Waves one. I don't think we've got this anywhere, but it's just a kind of sort of LUFS meter really. I'm sure we've got some inbuilt LUFS meters inside the various doors you might use. But yeah, we've got the Brainworks Saturator plugin that has that mono maker for the low end, the beginning of the chain. Let's go through, kind of equivalents. Linear phase EQ. You've got an in-house one with Logic that will have that, but you might need to kind of Google some good linear phase EQs. Linear phase multiband. I don't know about linear phase ones, but you'll certainly have other multiband compressors, and just use the idea of going in quite lightly with the bands and not actually using all the bands. That's another thing. Only going and focusing in on particular bands that you feel there are problems there. We've then got tape saturation. In terms of equivalent things in the studio, you would actually be probably looking at the some of the Ampex stuff and the Studer tape virtual tape machines that we've got as part of the UAD plugin bundles in the studios. That's what you kind of be looking for. That kind of that different tape formula even makes a difference on those things. To add in a bit of warmth and colour and characterisation there. We don't have anything equivalent of this. It's a Vitamin by Waves, but essentially it is just a harmonic exciter, but a multi-band version. Maybe the BX Saturator actually, but using it for what it's actually intended for. So we've got mid and side, high and low distortion saturation, so you can do a little bit of juicing up certain frequency bands, but you do it in terms of MS stuff here. Obviously that's what Brainworks are quite good at. Then Pro Compressor, you can do some of these features with the sidechain detection, the internal sidechain, and use the filters so that you're not always being triggered by the kick at each time. On a few of the sort of native compressor plugins inside Pro Tools and inside Logic, but that's essentially why I'm using that one there, is to ignore the kick drum, so you're not always clamping down on the loudest part of the track for each point. So obviously the kick's going to be the loudest thing each time. SSL compressor, well, we've literally got that in the studio, so you can always use that there, but we will certainly have a UAD equivalent model of the SSL stuff as well, that'll be worth checking out. Match EQ, again, this is just a built-in native one in Logic. I think it's really good. I don't think we've got that as its own tool in other DAWs or as a kind of standalone one. It might do some of that stuff on the Fab Filter EQ if any of you guys have got that at home. If not, we're kind of talking maybe some of the isotope based stuff might have the match EQ and the reference things in that sense. But I can't remember what that is off the top of my head. And then just gain staging into the input gain of the limiter, rather than riding that. It's riding the signal coming in here, and then just using the Pro L here, which we kind of talked about with the ML4000 by McDSP, and the precision limiter being in a kind of equivalent thing inside the UAD bundle as well. So yeah, you guys have all got those files to maybe have a go at doing that in this week before next week's mastering class. If you need a hand with any of this sort of stuff, or you've got any questions about this session or about mastering with regards to your work, just give us a shout, and I'll be more than happy to come and have a look at what you've been up to and what you guys are doing. But for now, I'm going to bid you a fond farewell, and I will catch you around the department at a later time. Alright, and guys, thanks very much. Cheers, folks. Bye-bye.